I'm excited to announce that my new book, The Tradition of Natural Taoism, is finally released today. Now, to launch this book, I want to give you a brief overview of the book. We'll briefly go over every chapter just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this work in relation to Taoism and what this will mean for understanding the actual tradition of Taoism going forward. As you might understand from the title, that it suggests that there is a natural tradition to Taoism that is slowly being lost and is being kind of undermined due to new pop Taoism that we find all over the place, right? All on YouTube, all on other platforms, even in books. There's a type of pop Taoism that is very new agey, that is not actually the tradition and goes a lot away from the fundamental teachings. So I want to explain to you today each chapter only briefly, but just to give you an idea of how important this book will be going forward for anyone who is serious in what Taoism actually is. So first of all, we come to the introduction, which I call Reclaiming Taoism. Now, I've done a previous video about how the inspiration behind this book was trying to revive the actual tradition of Taoism. Now, that's basically what the introduction gets into, why we need to understand Taoism as it truly is, rather than how a lot of people believe it actually is, according to like a lot of pop Taoism out there. Now, we will explore Taoism from the ancient Chinese traditional perspective from the two source texts of the Tao Te Ching and the Chuang-tzu. Now, this will set the foundation for the rest of the book. And as a result, I will explain why classical Taoism is a lot different from what people think of Taoism in the modern day. Now we come to chapter 1, the human reflection of the universe. In this chapter, I will explain the metaphysical framework of Taoism that has actually never been recorded before. For whatever reason, a lot of teachings in that don't put together the actual metaphysical framework of Taoism and how we should understand the teachings from a fundamental perspective. And so I will explain this all the way from the unmanifest, undifferentiated Tao all the way to the 10,000 things. And there's a whole gamut of philosophy and teachings and concepts to understand from that undifferentiated, unmanifest state to the manifest world. And I'll use a specific ancient diagram to depict this teaching and why we should understand it. And so as a result, I will go into how the universal unfolding is reflected in our very being, making the human a reflection of the entire universe. This idea that the big picture and the small picture are the same picture, but I'll go in depth into that in chapter 1. Now we come to chapter 2, Taoism's critique of Confucianism and socialization. So in this chapter, I will explain that Taoism was actually a critique of Confucianism throughout the Warring States period of China. Because if we understand Confucianism and Taoism, they are two opposite ends of the spectrum. One is a self-cultivation model and the other is a natural model, which I'll go more in depth in this chapter. And so I want to dispel a lot of false views around Confucius and Confucianism. Because remember, as I explain in this chapter, Taoism is a critique of Confucianism. They are not the same. And you will understand why when you read the book. So in regards to what I said about Confucianism being a self-cultivation model and Taoism being a natural model, I will explain why Taoism is the real natural system, which goes deep into its critique of how Confucius thought that his rules and regulations is actually what makes us human and makes us one with the Tao, which is completely against the natural and Taoist view. So now we come to chapter 3, the dissolution of identity. A lot of people don't consider this teaching and actually don't think it's part of Taoism, which is completely bonkers when you think about it, because it is the primary aim of Taoism. Taoism's ultimate aim is the dissolution of identity so the undifferentiated Tao can make use of you. Now, why a lot of people don't lean into this actual higher teaching of Taoism is completely strange, because I think that a lot of people approach Taoism with a tinge of individuality and self-interest, but it is not that type of tradition. Taoism is a non-dual tradition, but it is an integral non-dual tradition. It's not that it neglects the world out there, but it looks at everything in a holistic way. That's why it is an integral non-dual philosophy. And so part of that is the dissolution of identity. So as I said, Taoism is that integral non-dual system, but it's not spoken about in modern day pop Taoism for obvious reasons, right? Because of self-interest, because there's no marketability for that, right? You can't sell books, or people won't watch YouTube videos if you're talking about the complete dissolution of identity. That's when people start moving away. But that is one of the fundamental teachings of Taoism, whether we like it or not. So it's better to know Taoism as it is, as I mentioned in the introduction of this book, rather than having a fake modernized version of it that comes from primarily Western minds. And so it's important that we know Taoism as it is. And to know Taoism as it is to understand that the dissolution of identity is the ultimate aim of Taoism. Now we come to chapter 4, the immorality of morality. Now this type of Taoist knowledge makes people feel uncomfortable. But if you want to understand Taoism as it truly is, you have to understand that Taoism is primarily an amoral system. It doesn't have an ideology to impose upon you. I often call Taoism the ideology of no ideology. That is why in the Tao Te Ching and the Chuang-tzu texts, you often find stories that circumvent morality itself, saying how morality is what actually inculcates bad behavior and attitudes into people, because fundamentally we are naturally good if we look at it from the perspective of Mencius. And Lao Tzu leans into that teaching as well, as does Chuang-tzu. And so not many teachers or people in general explore this amoral perspective of Taoism, maybe because they're afraid to explore it, or they don't want to step on anyone's toes, or they're afraid to speak candidly about it in the face of moral systems. But Taoism doesn't care, in a sense, what people's views are, because it is the natural way. How can you argue with the natural way, right? So moral systems are man-made, and Taoism highlights this. And so a lot of people will probably have questions about this. Well, if there is no moral system, what will govern society? Well, that's why you need to read the book. You need to understand the amoral view of Taoism, and also how we got ourselves into this situation in the first place, right? And so that's what Lao Tzu and Chuang-tzu completely highlight all the time, right? Like, they are not saying that, in a sense, morality is not important in a society that's lost its way, but we have never questioned why we got into this mess in the first place, right? And why amorality itself is part of nature, and we often forget that human beings are part of nature. And so to be a Taoist, you have to understand this teaching to its nth degree, and I will explain that in my new book. And in understanding amorality in my new book, you will have a roadmap to go beyond good and evil, so that you come to an understanding of the true nature of oneness, which is the goal of Taoism itself. And other parts of this chapter are important as well, because we lean into Taoism's politically incorrect nature. And I use stories from the Chuang-tzu to explain this politically incorrect nature, right? And why political correctness is completely unnatural and is a type of tyranny that not many people question. And I will also explain that in this chapter of the immorality of morality. Now we come to chapter 5, Beyond Good and Evil. In this chapter, I will destroy the commonly held assumption that we are beasts from birth. Now, Taoism doesn't subscribe to this type of thinking that many other religions have, right? That we are beasts from birth. Taoism's fundamental perspective is that humans are naturally good, and it is society that trains us to be beasts, right? And so I'll go further and further into this view of Taoism in this chapter about going beyond good and evil. Now we come to chapter 6, the simple world versus the complex world. Now, this constant moving into a complex world is something that Taoism warned us about thousands of years ago. In the Tao Te Ching and the Chuang-tzu text, Lao Tzu and Chuang-tzu both warn us about the problems that are going to occur when we continually move into this complex world, right? And we move away from simplicity. And why they state that it is completely unnatural to live in a complex society and to have a complexified mind. And so obviously in the modern day, like speaking like this as I'm speaking to you is a completely foreign way of thinking, right? But in this chapter, I will double down on this and explain the simple world versus the complex world. So I will explain this battle between the natural simple world and the evolving complex world, and I will do this by using a core teaching in the Tao Te Ching that comes from Lao Tzu about the two desires. And we'll go into depth into that to explain this. And also a teaching in the Chuang-tzu related to the great undoing that has been only kept within some Taoist circles for thousands of years and hasn't been in the public. And I will explain to you what this teaching is. It's a secret understanding of one of the great stories in the Chuang-tzu, that of Butcher Ding. But this is a different understanding, a different way of thinking about it that was kept from the public for thousands of years, and I will explain it to you for the first time. Now we come to chapter 7, the art of doing nothing. Now this chapter is about the essential teaching of wu-wei, but I'm going to explain its many different ways of understanding and interpretations and how it applies to us in our modern lives in relation to Taoism. Now, there are a lot of teachers out there who don't really understand wu-wei. You'll hear them talk about wu-wei, but you can tell they're not actually versed in the actual literature and a deep understanding of the concept, right? So I'm going to explain what it means, especially in regards to the higher teachings that I speak about in this book, right? Because though wu-wei itself is an essential teaching of Taoism, and it should be our sort of modus operandi, but it still is a preliminary stage to reach the higher teachings that I'm going to speak about in this book. Now we come to chapter 8, the spontaneous reality. So according to Taoism, the real world of Tao is a spontaneous reality. Now this is related to one of the core concepts of Zitran, which is itself so nature or naturalness, if you will. But this is a core concept that supports this idea of the spontaneous reality. Now, I'll go deep into this, not just on the physical level, but on an internal level of what this means, the spontaneous reality, where I'll get into the nature of thoughts themselves and how thoughts are born. And so I will explore a lot of ideas that are rarely explored, like the unsupported thought, the illusion of thinking, mind-seeking, and the hidden teaching of what thoughts would be without language. Think about that. What thoughts would be without language. Now, that's something that I will cover in this chapter, and these are teachings that have never been heard before. And so I'm excited for all of you to read this chapter. Now we come to chapter 9, the last chapter, free and easy wandering in oneness. So the subtitle of my book is actually called The Way of Free and Easy Wandering in Oneness. Now this phrase is related to the highest teaching in Taoism, and some say the highest teaching of spirituality altogether, which is xiaoyao, which basically means free and easy wandering in oneness, or free and easy wandering, or aimless roaming. There are many interpretations that I explain in the book, but it is the most important teaching in all of Taoism, and according to Chuang-tzu, it would be the most important teaching for you to understand in your entire life. This is the highest spiritual teaching according to Taoism. And so it's very important to understand this teaching, because everything else from this place can be easily understood, and your life will have a certain grace about it once you embody this teaching. So this teaching for thousands of years has not been widely known and has been isolated to the great Taoist sages, or what we could call a genren, a genuine person or enlightened person in the Taoist tradition. It has been isolated to those individuals and hasn't been widely known in the public. And let's say not understood properly, right? Because though some people may have heard xiaoyao, some people don't really understand the actual heart of what this teaching is trying to explain to us. But that is the highest teaching. So I don't want to go further into xiaoyao. Go and grab the book. Please go and grab the book. What I've explained to you is only a really brief overview of each chapter. Obviously, I cannot explain each chapter to its nth degree, but I'm just so excited for you all to read it. And so please go and grab yourself a copy today. And if you enjoy, please leave a review on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Goodreads or any of those platforms. It helps authors a lot when you leave reviews. And obviously, it helps authors even more when you grab a copy. And I know a lot of my audience are excited about this new book. And it's finally out. It's taken a long time. I actually wrote most of this back in 2021, if you can believe it. But it's been a slow process of getting this out there. And I'm excited for all of you to finally read this today. And as I said, please leave a review or share it with your loved ones. And yeah, so that's all I have to say about that. I'm excited. I hope you're excited. And I hope you're all safe and sound. And I'll see you in the next video. Shanti, shanti, shanti.